Welcome to the deep dive. This session is really geared towards your AQA GCSE History Paper 2, that thematic study on health and the people.
That's right. And today we're diving into medieval medicine in England, so roughly the period between, say, 1250 and 1500.
Yep, and we've looked through the sources, the notes you might have, and basically our job is to pull out the key stuff you need to know.
Exactly. Think of it as us helping you get your head around how people back then actually understood illness, what they thought caused it, and, well, what they did about it.
And it's a really fascinating period, isn't it? Sometimes quite startling beliefs and practices.
Definitely. You get this weird mix of really ancient ideas, lots of natural remedies, incredibly strong religious beliefs, and, yeah, the very first, very risky attempts at surgery.
Okay, so where do we start? To get medieval medicine, you actually need to look backwards first, don't you?
You absolutely do. The foundations, they came straight from the ancient world, people living centuries before.
Right, names you've probably bumped into. Hippocrates, the ancient Greek guy, and Galen from Roman times. Their ideas were just fundamental, weren't they? Even hundreds of years later.
Totally. Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, he gave us the theory of the four humors. That's the absolute bedrock.
So the idea that your body is made of four main fluids.
Exactly. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Simple as that in their view.
And if they were all nicely balanced, you were healthy. Get that out of whack, and you were ill.
Spot on. And they linked it to everything, the seasons, the elements, even your personality. It was a whole system for understanding health.
Okay, so that's Hippocrates. Then Galen comes along.
Yeah, Galen, Roman physician. He took Hippocrates' ideas and sort of built on them, expanded the Humours theory.
And added the theory of opposites.
That's the one. The idea that if you had too much of a cold humor, like phlegm, you'd treat it with something hot.
Like eating a chili pepper or something.
Kind of, yeah. Or hot herbs. He also did loads of work on anatomy, dissecting animals.
Ah, but animals, not humans. That's key, isn't it?
It's crucial. He used pigs, apes mainly. So, while it was amazing for the time, some of his conclusions about how bodies worked were, well, wrong for humans.
Right. Which brings us to a really important question for your GCSE. Why on earth did these ancient ideas, flaws and all, stick around for so long? Right into the 1400s in England.
Yeah, that's central. There were a few massive reasons. First off, the church.
The biggest power around back then.
Absolutely. And the church loved Hippocrates and Galen. Galen's idea of a perfectly designed body, you see, it fitted perfectly with their belief in a divine creator.
And crucially, these theories didn't involve dissecting humans, which the church completely forbade.
Exactly. They believed the body had to be whole for resurrection, for the soul. So no cutting up people.
Which basically starved medicine of proper anatomical knowledge for centuries.
It really did. Plus, you just didn't have the scientific understanding or, frankly, the inclination to challenge these ancient texts. Universities were controlled by the church.
And they taught these books. Galen, Hippocrates,
Yeah.
that was the curriculum.
Pretty much. There wasn't really an environment where you could easily question the old ways of thinking.
Okay, so that's the foundation, these ancient ideas.
Yeah.
Now, let's look at what people in medieval England actually thought caused them to get ill. It seems like a mix, natural and supernatural.
Yes, definitely both. You have to understand that combination. On the natural side, the big one, as we've said, was that imbalance of the four humors.
That was the go-to explanation.
It really was. So physicians spent ages trying to work out which humor was out of balance.
And how do they do that? I read something about urine.
Ah, yes. Urine analysis, standard practice. They'd look at the color, the thickness, smell it, sometimes even taste it.
Whoa, real.
Apparently so. And they had these detailed charts, urine charts, trying to match the sample to a specific imbalance. Sounds bizarre to us, but it was their diagnostic tool.
Okay, besides humors, what other natural causes? Miasma.
Miasma, yeah, that was massive. The belief that bad air, foul smells literally carried disease.
So like air from swamps or rotting rubbish or battlefields.
Exactly. If you breathed in that nasty air, the miasma, it could make you ill.
So people tried to avoid bad smells. Makes sense, in a way.
They absolutely did. They'd carry bunches of sweet-smelling herbs like lavender or rosemary or wear pomanders.
Little balls filled with perfume.
Yeah, or lockets. Anything to create a bubble of nice air around them to ward off the miasma. Even town councils sometimes ordered cleanups.
But not because they knew about germs.
No, purely because they thought the bad smell itself caused the disease. Get rid of the smell, get rid of the illness.
Fascinating. They were stumbling towards public health, but for completely the wrong reason.
Precisely. And things like diet and hygiene were linked in too, often back to the Humours.
Like the regimen sanitatis, that advice thing.
Yes, that guide to healthy living. It covered diet, don't eat too much, exercise, sleep, keeping calm, all aimed at keeping those humors balanced. Though it also had some odd advice like avoiding south winds or barking dogs.
Right. Okay, so that's the natural side. What about the supernatural causes? The church's influence must have been huge here.
Immense. Illness was very often seen as being sent by God.
As a punishment.
That was the most common belief, yes. Punishment for sin. If you were ill, particularly with something nasty like leprosy, people often thought it was because you'd done something wrong in God's eyes.
So getting better wasn't just about medicine. It was about getting right with God.
For many people, yes, prayer, confession, trying to appease God was just as important, if not more so, than seeing a doctor.
And astrology. Stars and planets affecting health. That seems a bit strange for doctors.
It seems strange to us, but it was completely normal then. Physicians genuinely believed the alignment of stars and planets influenced your body and could cause epidemics.
So they consult star charts.
Definitely. To help diagnose, but also, really importantly, to decide the best time for treatment. When was the moon in the right phase for bloodletting, for example? People wore astrological charms for protection, too.
Crikey. So faced with all that humors, miasma, God, stars, what did people actually do to try and get better? What were the treatments?
Well, it was a real mix, mirroring the causes. You had natural treatments trying to fix the body, and supernatural ones trying to appeal to higher powers. And honestly, most didn't work because they didn't understand the real causes.
Let's start with the natural ones. Herbs seem fairly sensible.
Yeah, herbal remedies were everywhere. Mixing herbs to drink as potions, breathing in the steam, adding them to baths. Common sense things like aloe vera for digestion, alongside more complex recipes like theriaca,
What was theriaca?
a famous, complicated mixture, sometimes with dozens of ingredients, including things like viper flesh, used for snake bites, but also loads of other illnesses. Seen as a bit of a cure-all.
Right, and food is medicine too.
Yep, certain foods were thought to help, like blanc mangier, a sort of bland chicken and almond dish, good for the sick, easy to digest, helped balance things.
And bathing.
Hot baths were thought to help dissolve or melt excess humors, often with herbs added. Though you also get some really weird examples, like that source mentioning boiling a fox.
Boiling a fox, yes.
Yes.
To cure paralysis.
Apparently. Shows how desperate or perhaps just different their thinking was.
Okay, moving on from boiled foxes. What about the more hands-on humoral treatments? Trying to force the balance.
Ah, the rebalancing acts. Bloodletting was incredibly common, probably the single most used treatment.
And they did that in different ways?
3 main ways, usually. Cutting a vein directly, often near the elbow. Using leeches to suck the blood out.
Leeches. Nice.
Yeah. Or cupping. They'd heat a cup to create a vacuum, make small cuts on the skin, and stick the cup on to draw the blood out.
Grim. And purging. Making people sick or...
Making them vomit or have diarrhea to get rid of excess humors that way. They used emetics, bitter herbs, to make you throw up, or laxatives like mallow leaves.
Sounds delightful.
And sometimes enemas, too, using a pipe and a pig's bladder to squirt mixtures. Well, you get the idea. All aimed at flushing the system.
And the theory of opposites came into treatment, too.
Yes, always. Got a fever, something hot, apply a cooling lotion, got the chills, something cold, eat warming foods, wrap up warm, basic principle.
Okay, so those are the natural, physical approaches. What about the supernatural side of treatment?
Well, like we said, astrologers timing things, but mainly it was about religion. The king's touch was a big one.
People thought the king could heal them just by touching them.
Yes, particularly for a disease called scrofula, a type of tuberculosis affecting the neck glands. Because of the divine right of kings, the belief was God gave the monarch healing powers. People would queue up.
Wow. And other religious methods.
Loads promoted by the church. Prayer, obviously. Using charms or saying specific religious words. Making offerings at saints' shrines. Saints were believed to work miracles.
Touching holy relics.
Yeah.
Like bones of a saint.
Exactly. Lighting huge candles, sometimes the height of the person or the afflicted body part. Fasting. Going on pilgrimage to holy places like Canterbury or Walsingham.
But didn't this focus on God sometimes stop people looking for actual cures?
Absolutely. This is a really key point for your essays. That deep belief that illness and recovery were ultimately God's will meant many people, especially the poor, felt it was pointless, maybe even sinful, to seek earthly cures. Why interfere with God's plan?
Which must have just reinforced the idea that treatments didn't work, because often people weren't trying them. They were trying things that were ineffective anyway.
Precisely. It's a complex cycle.
So who are the actual people providing this care? Who are the medieval medics?
Right. Well, at the very top, you had the physicians, university trained, maybe 7, 10 years of study, highly educated.
Educated in what?
Educated in the ancient texts, Hippocrates, Galen, all approved by the church. Many physicians were actually clergymen themselves.
Which meant they couldn't get their hands dirty.
Often, yes.
Huh.
Church rules meant they couldn't do things involving blood or much manual work. Their job was diagnosis, looking at urine, consulting star charts, applying the theories, very little hands-on practice.
So if surgery was needed,
the physician might stand there and read from a book while someone else, like a surgeon, did the actual cutting. And even examining the patient properly often cost extra. They mainly prescribed remedies for others to make.
and they were rare and expensive.
Incredibly so. Mostly found in towns, serving royalty, nobles, rich merchants, definitely not accessible for your average person.
So who did most people go to?
They'd usually see an apothecary, or more likely, a local wise woman.
Apothecaries,
Hmm.
like early chemists.
Sort of, yeah. They mixed and sold herbal remedies, often based on physicians' prescriptions or recipe books like the Materia Medica, much cheaper than a physician.
But maybe not always trusted.
Sometimes controversial, yes. Physicians looked down on them a bit, and they were known sometimes to sell poisons or dabble in alchemy or magic, which the church frowned upon.
And wise women.
They were really the main healthcare providers in villages and homes, usually women using traditional herbal knowledge passed down, often grown in their own gardens. They acted as midwives, maybe did some basic first aid, set bones, pulled teeth.
Not formally trained, but practical experience.
Exactly. Lots of practical knowledge, often highly respected within their communities.
Okay, we keep coming back to the church. Let's really nail down its overall impact. Help or hindrance? This feels like a classic exam question.
It really is, and the answer is both. It's complicated. On the plus side, you have hospitals.
The church set up hospitals.
Loads of them. By 1500, over 1,000 in England, often attached to monasteries run by monks and nuns. Places like St. Bartholomew's in London started this way.
But what do they actually do in these hospitals? Or were they trying to cure people?
Mostly no. That's a crucial difference from modern hospitals. Because they believed illness was God's will, the focus was on care, not cure. Providing rest, food, warmth, prayer, keeping things clean, looking after the soul as much as the body.
So comfort for the sick and dying rather than medical treatment.
Largely, yes. Some non-religious hospitals might employ physicians, but the church-run ones focused on care and prayer. They were charitable institutions.
Okay, so that's the help side. What about the hindrance? How did the church bloc progress?
In some really significant ways. Firstly, just their sheer authority and the widespread belief in illness being God's punishment or test discouraged searching for physical causes and cures. Why challenge God?
And they actively promoted the old, often wrong, ideas.
Yes, because Galen's ideas fitted their worldview. They controlled all knowledge. They approved the university texts. Monks copied books by hand, ensuring nothing contradicted church teaching.
Didn't they arrest someone for questioning things?
Roger Bacon, yeah. A monk who dared to suggest doctors should do their own experiments and not just trust the old books. The church locked him up. Shows how tight their control was.
And the biggest block was probably that ban on human dissection.
Arguably, yes. It directly prevented any real understanding of human anatomy. Even later, when they allowed dissections of executed criminals, if they found something that contradicted Galen.
They just explained it away.
Exactly. They'd say the criminal's body was imperfect because they were a sinner, so Galen was still right about normal bodies. It completely stifled anatomical discovery.
So, a key takeaway for you GCSE. The church provided essential care, but also acted as a major barrier to medical progress.
That sums it up well. Now, it's worth briefly looking outside England, because the Islamic world at this time was way ahead in some areas.
Right, places like Baghdad were huge centers of learning.
They were, and a key difference was attitude. The Prophet Muhammad had encouraged followers to seek cures, believing God provided remedies for illnesses. So there was a religious drive for discovery.
And they had some brilliant physicians.
Absolutely. Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, wrote a massive encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, which became a standard textbook in Europe for centuries. Al-Razi, or Razes, first described the difference between smallpox and measles. He even wrote a book called Doubts About Galen.
Questioning Galen. That was brave.
It was. And Ibn al-Nafis figured out how blood circulated through the lungs long before European doctors did, correcting one of Galen's big mistakes.
So much more advanced. Did this knowledge filter through to England?
Some did, slowly. Texts were translated, and they had similarities, belief in old theories, prayer, hospitals, but Islamic hospitals by Maristans aimed to cure people, treated everyone, including the mentally ill. Very different focus.
Why didn't it have more impact in England then?
Well, the Crusades didn't help, created a lot of suspicion, and again, the church in Europe wasn't keen on ideas that challenged Galen or their control over knowledge.
Okay, let's switch gears completely now. Surgery. Sounds like something you'd want to avoid at all costs in medieval times.
You absolutely would. It was incredibly dangerous. 3 massive problems: blood loss, infection, and pain.
And they had no answers.
Basically, no. No understanding of germs meant dirty instruments, dirty hands, filthy operating spaces. Infection was almost guaranteed. No reliable anesthetics.
What did they use for pain? Anything.
They tried natural stuff like mandrake root, opium, hemlock, but dosages were impossible to get right too little, and it didn't work too much. And you could kill the patient or send them into shock. Often they just held people down.
Grim. And surgeons had to work fast.
As fast as humanly possible because of the pain and blood loss, which, combined with poor anatomical knowledge thanks to the dissection ban, meant mistakes were common and often fatal.
Who were the people doing these operations? Not usually the university physicians.
No, mostly barber surgeons, guys who cut hair and shaved beards, but also did basic surgery, pulling teeth, setting bones, treating wounds, maybe even amputations.
That's where the red and white pool comes from.
Exactly. Red for blood, white for bandages. They learned through apprenticeship, so they had practical skills, unlike many physicians, and they were cheaper.
What sorts of surgery did they attempt?
Amputation was common for serious limb injuries, usually with a saw. Trepanning, drilling a hole in the skull.
Why on earth would they do that?
Sometimes to let out evil spirits believed to cause madness or epilepsy, sometimes maybe to relieve pressure from a head injury. And incredibly, archaeological digs show skulls where the bone has healed. Some people actually survived it.
Blimey. What else?
Cauterization, using a red-hot iron to seal wounds and stop bleeding. Agonizing, but sometimes necessary to prevent bleeding to death.
Despite all these dangers, were there any surgeons making advances, pushing things forward a bit?
There were a few, yes. In England, you had John Bradmore, famous for removing an arrowhead from the future King Henry V's face after a battle. He used honey, which has antiseptic properties, to help clean the wound.
And John of Ardern.
Yeah, he worked during the 100 Years' War. Battlefield surgery really pushes innovation. He formed a surgeons guild, wrote a surgical manual blending English, Arab, and ancient ideas, developed new techniques for treating things like anal abscesses.
Anyone else notable? From outside England?
Definitely Abulcasis, from Islamic Spain. Wrote a hugely influential book, invented loads of surgical instruments still recognizable today, like forceps. He also described hemophilia. And Hugh and Theodoric of Lucca, Italian father and son surgeons, argued against letting wounds get full of pus, which most thought was necessary for healing, and advocated cleaning wounds with wine, an early glimmer of antiseptic practice.
Right, okay. Let's zoom out from individual treatments to the wider community. Public health. What were medieval towns actually like to live in?
Generally pretty disgusting, especially compared to today. No proper sewage systems. People threw human waste, household rubbish straight into the street or the nearest river.
Which was also their drinking water source.
Often, yes. Communal toilets or privies often overflowed into streets or gardens. Cesspits leaked. And waste from messy trades like butchers or tanners often went straight into the rivers, too. No concept of germs linking filth to disease.
Did anyone try to clean things up? Local councils.
They did make some attempts, yeah. Often motivated by miasma theory, trying to reduce the bad smells. They brought in fines for dumping waste, passed rules about where butchers could operate, tried to keep the Thames a bit cleaner in London. They even had officials called gongfirmers.
Gongfirmers. What did they do?
Their job was to empty out the privies and cesspits, usually at night, and muckrakers to sweep the streets. So some effort was made.
But it didn't really work.
Not very well. Laws were hard to enforce. People ignored them. The focus on smell rather than the actual source of disease meant efforts were often misdirected. And that underlying belief that God sent disease meant people didn't always see the point of keeping clean.
How did monasteries compare? They were supposed to be much cleaner, weren't they?
Much, much cleaner. Several reasons. Monks were usually educated. They could read ancient texts about hygiene and planning. They understood the importance of separating waste from water supplies.
They had better facilities.
Often, yes. Elaborate pipe systems for water, sometimes filtered. Well-built latrines that were emptied regularly, with the waste often used as fertilizer. Their religious life also emphasized order and cleanliness. Plus, monasteries were often wealthier and located away from crowded towns, giving them access to cleaner water and some isolation during epidemics.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of medieval medicine and public health, the Black Death, arriving in 1348.
The big one, a truly devastating pandemic. Estimates vary, but it likely killed somewhere between a third and half of the population of Europe, maybe more.
And medieval people had absolutely no idea what caused it.
None at all. We now know it was primarily bubonic plague, spread by fleas living on black rats, and also pneumonic plague, spread person to person through coughing. But they didn't know about bacteria or viruses or fleas carrying disease.
So what did they blame? A whole range of things. Supernatural causes were huge. God's wrath, punishment for sin, signs of the apocalypse. Some blamed unusual alignments of the planets. Natural causes focused on miasma, again, maybe corrupt air blown from distant earthquakes or volcanoes, or just rising from local filth. And tragically, in some parts of Europe, though not so much England, where they'd already been expelled, Jewish communities were scapegoated and attacked.
Horrific. What did they try and do to treat it once people got sick?
Mostly the same ineffective things. Praying, confessing sins, bleeding and purging, which probably just weakened patients further. Trying strong smells like vinegar or burning herbs to fight the miasma. Some tried herbal remedies like theriaca. Lancing the buvoes, the painful swellings, was sometimes attempted. That might have occasionally helped by draining pus, but it was incredibly risky and painful. Mostly people felt helpless.
What about trying to prevent it? Stop people getting sick in the first place? Again, a mix. Supernatural prevention. More prayer, fasting, going on pilgrimage, whipping themselves the flagellants, hoping to show God they were sorry for their sins. Natural prevention, running away, fleeing to the countryside if you could afford it, hoping for cleaner air, carrying flowers or herbs constantly to ward off miasma, and, bizarrely to us, avoiding bathing.
Avoiding washing, why?
They thought hot water opened the pores in the skin, letting the bad air, the miasma, get in more easily, so staying dirty was seen as protective. Even listening to cheerful music was advised to keep spirits and humors up.
What did the authorities do? The king? Local councils? Was there any effective government action?
Very little, really. They did introduce quarantine laws, forcing ships or travelers to wait 40 days, quaranta giorni in Italian, hence quarantine, before entering a town. But these were hard to enforce.
Did they try shutting down towns?
Sometimes, but it rarely worked. People panicked and fled anyway. And sometimes councils did counterproductive things based on miasma, like stopping street cleaning because they thought the stench of rubbish might drive away the plague. They couldn't challenge the church by banning mass gatherings or processions. The rich often ignored rules. King Edward III made proclamations, but there wasn't a strong, centralized, effective response like we'd expect today.
So the response was hampered by the same things that hampered medicine generally. Lack of knowledge, the wrong theories like miasma, the power of the church, and limited government power.
Exactly. Though the sheer scale of the Black Death did shake things up a bit. It made some people question the church, question the old medical ideas. It didn't cause immediate change, but it perhaps sowed some seeds of doubt for the future.
Well, this deep dive has certainly shown what a different world medieval medicine was. This blend of ancient ideas, strong faith, herbal remedies, and, well, sheer superstition.
It really highlights those key factors for your GCSE. The huge influence of religion and the church, the limits of science and observation back then, the importance of individuals like apothecaries and wise women, and how little government could or did do about public health or major crises. Understanding this sets the scene for what comes next.
Definitely. So, as a final thought, thinking particularly about that devastating Black Death and the desperate, often misguided responses to it, what do you listening think was the single biggest thing stopping people in medieval England from tackling the plague more effectively? Was it the lack of scientific knowledge? The power of the church? Or something else entirely?
Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
See you next time.